I'd like to welcome Matt Wakelin to the stage. Matt's a landscape architect who is going to talk to us about landscape design-led application of Pasifika spatiality in the context of urban development in Eastern Haurira. Welcome, Matt.
Ko Pukearanga te maunga, ko Nunguru te awa, ko Huruhuru manu tuaka, ko te raroa te iwi, ko te uri o tai te hapu, ko Mōrehu te marae, no tutukaka hau. O le mote o te sao, ai o upolu, o lo ua sānapu, o lo whaayu o ungapo, e eats, o lo ingoa Matt Wakelin. Kia ora tātou katoa, manuia le awauli. I am Matt. I'm a Master's Graduate of Landscape Architecture from Victoria University of Wellington. Since finishing uni, that's a bit weird. Can you go to this first slide? I'm keeping it away. One more. Yeah, cool. Okay, so since finishing uni, I've kind of been floating and involving myself in different projects. I was just recently involved in the installation and planting of a roof forest at the Hundavasa Art Centre up in my hometown, Whangarei. Working with plants, in particular, working with our native ecologies, has always been a primary fascination for me in the landscape. But in this presentation, I'm going to be winding back to my master's thesis that I finished early last year and drawing out a part of that, which I thought could sit well with this theme. So this short presentation draws upon what I learned about the relationships between landscape and belonging, and what that might mean for designing our urban environments and infrastructure. And what I was trying to do with this project is understand what could be introduced into an urban transformation so as to move towards a more meaningful and holistic form of South Pacific urbanism. So this project began with personal concerns about the water quality of Te Awaroa o Poriroa's Onepoto Inlet. This was once the food basket for local mana whenua, supplying food and everything necessary to sustain the lives of those who made this rohe home. To Ngāti Toa, who are the mana whenua of this rohe, this is the living, breathing and sustaining body, central to daily life and embedded in their whakapapa. For the people of Ngāti Toa, this hasn't changed. They are the harbour and the harbour is them. And a reciprocal relationship or kinship between giving to and taking from the harbour, whakautu, is essential in the upholding of cultural values and lasting ecosystem health. During the expansion of our urban environments, singular authorships of engineering and the design and construction of municipal infrastructure systems have seen serious environmental degradation, with urban water bodies often becoming sinks for untreated urban runoff from a variety of land uses. Mismanagements of urban stormwater and wastewater systems in particular have greatly or entirely reduced the capacity of urban water bodies to provide essential ecosystem services such as recreation and education, while Māori food sources and other cultural values associated with urban waterways are often completely overlooked. The default logics associated with urban expansion currently rely on new undeveloped land being level, resulting in the permanent loss of natural character. And in Te Awaroa o Poriroa, hill crests are scraped flat, valleys and streamscapes are filled in, erosion increases, and sediment-laden runoff alters the tidal prism of the harbour. And to Ngāti Toa, whose whakapapa and sense of belonging is synonymous with the topography and the water bodies that shape it, this is incredibly destructive, and it can't be recovered for future generations. So this evidence suggests that the logic of infrastructure provision that focuses on a particular ambition of centrality and immediate efficiency are at root flawed. These systems need to be re-engineered by reimagining and reorientating. And this is where I see that landscape architecture can offer insight through its transdisciplinary understandings across its multiple faculties and scales of operation. So So in Aotearoa, the demand for housing and infrastructure is burgeoning. In Porirua, we're expecting to see a population increase of up to 30,000 in the next 3 decades. And when we add the issue of demand for housing, the deep systematic problems of infrastructure provision are highlighted. So to investigate the potentials within this tension, I began to investigate what infrastructure means. The formal definition of state's infrastructure as the basic physical and organisational structures and facilities needed for the operation of society. For the purpose of this project, I made a more landscapey definition, being an organised system which structures and reinforces the way a society utilises, interprets, and experiences landscape and nature. So this definition aims to surface infrastructure's fundamental role in structuring our daily lives and our relationships with the landscape and each other. So when I say infrastructure, I'm not only referring to the underground pipes, parks and roads, but all the primary constituents that create an urban paradigm. This includes private property boundaries, fences, and other approaches to ownership. So it's pretty clear at this stage that the default infrastructural logics in Porirua were not only working against the cultural values of Ngāti Toa, but all cultures that enjoy an abundant natural environment. So in a motivation to find an alternative to the default and to get a conversation going, I made a term infrastructural equity, which describes infrastructural logics that consider all cultural backgrounds across the interests of human and non-human entities. It takes into consideration the long-term effects we have on our landscape by treating our future generations with the same equity. It acknowledges that all humans are inextricably connected and reliant on the health of the ecosystems, and that we all have a right to the natural abundance that a healthy ecosystem provides. So this became an important vantage point for the imagining of ways we can extend local ecologies into performative infrastructures, and uncovering potentials in infrastructural systems which merge ecosystem services, cultural values, with social, water, and even transport infrastructures that function within a living landscape. So there's already a few examples of infrastructural equity that are in practice that we know of, such as using integrated constructive wetlands to treat stormwater and wastewater by extending local ecology and thus improving the quality of life across the human and non-human. Examples of what I consider a form of infrastructural equity in Aotearoa include legal personhoods given to Te Awa Tupua and Te Uruwera, as this status kind of recognises that intergenerational wealth relies on a healthy ecosystem and describes a kinship between humans and the landscape. The notion of living landscapes and water bodies is embedded in Te Ao Māori as kia ora ki tai, the understanding of whatever happens upstream will affect everything downstream. And this consequently draws the crucial relationship between water bodies and their catchments, or whaitua. So this pointed me towards a more holistic approach, which views the landscape as a series of catchments in order to really understand our relationship with and our effects on the landscape. The principles of kia ora ki tai are often circulated at the regional scales, but there is very little direct application at the neighbourhood scales, let alone urban catchments in general. So I saw potential here using this logic to reimagine some approaches to urbanism. And so to experiment with this idea of infrastructural equity with design, I selected the Cannons Creek catchment in eastern Porirua as my site. I felt like from this site there was heaps to discover. So it was land that's already been developed in the past, so any new developments would have to be by means of intensifying the current urban areas. And the community is largely made up of Māori and Pacific peoples who together form 84% of the population. It's 18% Māori and 66% Pacific ethnicities. And I found this particularly important to this project, as to date it is these communities which are the most underrepresented when it comes to our default modes of urban growth and housing provision in Aotearoa. And also, this area is actually in the process of being developed, as I know some of us in here are involved. So in order to design and imagine alternative possibilities in the urban landscape of Cannons Creek. I needed to discover more deeply how Māori and Pasifika worldviews could influence the spatial realm. My research took me to the works of Epeli Hauofa, Albert Mint, and Albert Rifiti, whose perspectives in Pacific anthropology and architecture give agency to landscape discourse towards imagining urbanisms that begin to recognise our cultural and geographical presence within the South Pacific. The research gave visibility to operative concepts embedded in the South Pacific cosmogony, where the spatial realm is structured through relationships between individuals, collective, and the landscape. So this already began to interrogate the tendencies of boundaries and separation, being the dominant constituent of urban space in the Western thought. And a particularly interesting and mobilising theory on Polynesian space came from architect Albert Rifiti's work called Mawai and Tōwhinga. And I'll quickly summarise the theory. His work interprets Mawai as kind of the spreading forces that structure pathways and connections in the landscape, while Tōwhinga is the converging force that gathers around certain points in the landscape. And Rifiti proposes that together Mawai and Tōwhinga work to connect and codify relationships as spatial and geographical networks, forming and connecting territories that reflect unique becomings that emerge when a community relates to its local conditions. This is where I thought that landscape architecture has potential to better understand the tasks of shaping these relationships, or the va. So the term va is key in understanding space and identity and the South Pacific, and can be described as the unifying space between things, expressing how space joins rather than creates distance, and in doing so, holds space together through relationships. So in this research, va was interpreted as space that draws relationships between people and natural built entities in the landscape. So in this framing, va becomes something landscape architecture can work with to better understand and foster meaningful relationships between people and place through active design. Rifiti's work suggests that across geographical space, this notion of va organises itself into nested scales based on the intensity of personal relationships with people in the landscape. And this geographical relationship structure is called alanga, and is referred to as the structure of belonging, with meaningful relationships holding the individual within its family space, the family within the community space, and the community spaces within the wider district. And I found alanga to be a really mobilising strategy for reimagining urban logics that focus on drawing relationships between people, families, communities, and the living landscapes that they share, allowing for their own unique becomings. For this project, it provided a framework where a sense of belonging would be weaved into housing and infrastructure provisions from the very beginning, and doing it in a way that is distinctly Pacific. It became clear that if I was to achieve infrastructural equity in the Cannons Creek community, I would have to develop a strategy which ensures that belonging is enabled from the very beginning. And the idea of belonging became useful for me in this project because I found it expresses this kinship, again, between people and the landscape, similar to Kiuta-Kitai and legal personhoods, and this blurs their current approaches towards land ownership. So it was important for this project that infrastructure and housing must be designed and must operate in a way that reflects this kinship to really afford a sense of belonging. So in the context of Cannons Creek, I set up to test ways to structure relationships that soften the physical boundaries between public and private spaces, and design communities in a way that structures relationships through living catchments. And to consolidate this, I created a kind of infrastructural equity belonging strategy that uses the logics of nested catchment scales to situate the inhabitant within the community and the community within the living landscape. The strategy operates between 4 primary scales of organisation, or loops, that draw parallels with the Kiuta-Kitai logic and the alanga structure. So first there's the whānau loop, which includes a household, its lot, and simple systems like rainwater collection, grey water recycling, enough land for a bit of food production, sunlight and views. The second loop, the Hapori loop, which relates to its immediate neighbourhood and catchment, which focuses on mixed housing provisions, small to medium community commons, gardens, and strong relationships to the water and topography. Natural stormwater and wastewater treatments can also occur at the scale. The third loop, or the Hapori Whānui loop, which includes the wider community, schools, shops, libraries, churches, and this focuses on larger community spaces, parks, sports fields, and aims to centre public life around the main stream. And then fourth is the Whaitua loop, which includes the entire catchment, which kind of gives a unique identity and has a variety of land uses. So after making this strategy, I found it necessary to get familiar with this identity of the Whaitua, and get an idea of how I can work with this natural identity and its living landscape. So I embarked on a hikoi from the bottom to the very top of the Whaitua and recorded all the interesting things found along the way. The main thing that got me was how much richness and variety was suppressed once it got to the urban realm. I recorded how topography, vegetation and water courses can construct different experiences and thresholds, which I found useful in reimagining the ways I could design public and private interfaces and create meaningful public space. The next stage was to start the design experiment process. And as part of the strategy, I looked at the urban or suburban space in Cannons Creek as a series of small and neighbourhood-sized catchments, all within their unique topographical profiles, and all had their own opportunities. And for zooming in again, for further design experimentation, I just extracted one of these neighbourhood catchments to use for design experimentation. And for this catchment, I found the opportunity in the parts that were under government or council ownership, so leaving those privately owned dwellings alone and kind of fitting it in the space between. So the first action design was the surfacing of all the drainage systems in a way which introduces the sense of the living landscape, better connecting the neighbourhood to the topography and the rhythms of nature, and introducing a sense of richness and variety. The drainage system works in 3 phases, dealing with light to heavy flow, and includes retention wetlands to slow water during high rainfall, to provide recreational nodes and passive irrigation. The system draws from the Tuia strategy and uses native species to treat stormwater runoff at the very source before it enters the stream and into the harbour. And many of the species that enhance water quality are also employed mahinga kai or rongoa taonga, enabling the access to these cultural values. So the second act of design is to introduce housing which structures itself around the water courses. The housing provision and dwelling sizes are informed by what sort of whānau already live and exist in Cannons Creek and what has been projected for the future of the community. The dwelling sizes are mixed, ranging from 1 to 3 inhabitants to 6 plus, and there are also some medium density and mixed use developments that sit closer to the Cannons Creek Centre. The floor plans are designed in accordance to the Pacific Design Guide, providing flexibility for family events, maximise sunlight and strong relationship with the outdoors. They've also been designed with rainwater collection and grey water systems in mind. The dwellings sit in freehold lots within shared tenancies, with the potential of 2 to 5 of these dwellings sharing ownership over any access lanes and open spaces around the perimeters, which is unboarded space that can be used to produce food, extend outdoor living, and create softer relationships between private, semi-private, and public. Then the third act of design was introducing pathways and drawing these relationships between dwellings, public spaces, and the streamscape. In this sense, it was important that there were no dead ends. Similar to the drainage system, it comes in 3 phases. The first is pedestrian cycle access only. The second widens to include vehicle access for residents only. And the third widens to allow public vehicle access, but all 3 favour pedestrian right-of-way. And I really like the idea that every path carries you towards a stream. And if you imagine all the other neighbourhood catchments also leading to the stream then becomes a spinal component of community life, something which I can feel can really contribute to a collective sense of belonging. And so what emerged was the potential of a compact neighbourhood ecosystem that not only aligns with topography and local conditions, but lives there. The weaving of the watercourses and the pathways create diverse moments within the public realm and creates a unifying meshwork of relation across the landscape, connecting with other hapori or neighbourhood catchments. The retaining of topography, creation of micro-topographies and strategic planting reduces the need for hard-edged boundaries and allows territories to emerge from the ground in their own ways, in accordance to the unique relationships that form between neighbours and neighbourhoods. The idea is that through design we can facilitate becoming over imposing by allowing people to have influence over their own surroundings. Insights into Pacific spatiality in Te Ao Māori shows us that infrastructure, housing, water quality and cultural equality don't have to follow separate strategies. They show us that we can transcend the compartmentalising approaches to infrastructure and housing provision and allow this kinship between land and people that is so fundamental in Māori and Pacific space, accessible across all cultures. This project also showed that through landscape architecture, not only is it possible to design and facilitate relationships in the landscape, but also facilitate relationships between professions. Something that I found is crucial if we are to achieve infrastructural and spatial equity. So yeah, I feel like this work is still in its initial stages, so feel free to let me know what you think. Cool, thanks for that.